There is a town in Pennsylvania where the ground has been on fire for more than 60 years. Not the surface, not a brush fire, not a structure fire, not anything that a hose and a crew of firefighters could have handled on a Tuesday afternoon. The ground itself. The rock and coal seams and compressed organic matter, hundreds of feet below the surface of a quiet borough in Schuylkill County, burning continuously since 1962, burning right now as you watch this, burning in the dark under what used to be a neighborhood of working families and corner stores, and a Catholic church and a Little League field, burning in a place where almost no one is left to notice the smoke coming up through the cracks in the earth. Centralia, Pennsylvania is one of the strangest places in the United States. Not strange in a manufactured way, not strange because someone decided it would be a good tourist attraction. Strange in the way that only truly uncontrollable things can be strange. Strange because something happened there that humans tried to stop and failed, tried to understand and partially succeeded, tried to fix and gave up on, and then simply walked away from, leaving the fire to do what fire does, which is burn, endlessly, patiently, without any awareness that it has outlasted the town above it. If you want to understand what is actually happening under Centralia right now, what is left down there, what the fire has done to the geology in the 6 decades since it started, what happens to a landscape when heat moves through it not in a flash, but in a slow, inexorable crawl through connected seams of combustible material deep underground. Subscribe right now, because we are going down into something that most people have never had explained to them properly, and it is stranger and more fascinating and more unsettling than the version you have probably heard before. Let us start with what Centralia was, because you cannot understand what it became without understanding what it was, and what it was is a story that belongs to a specific moment in American history, to the era of anthracite coal mining in the mountains of northeastern Pennsylvania, to a world that is largely gone now but whose physical infrastructure still runs beneath the hills of Schuylkill County like the skeleton of something enormous. Anthracite coal, hard coal, the kind of coal that burns cleaner and hotter than the softer bituminous coal that you find in other parts of the Appalachian coal fields. Anthracite is older, more compressed, further along in the geological process of carbon concentration that turns plant material into combustible rock over millions of years. The anthracite coal fields of northeastern Pennsylvania were formed during the Carboniferous period, roughly 300 million years ago, when the region that would become Pennsylvania was a vast tropical swamp, low-lying and warm, covered in forests of enormous tree ferns and club mosses and seed plants, not the deciduous trees we associate with Pennsylvania today, but something more primordial. A version of forest that existed before flowers, before most of the animal groups we recognize, in a world that was fundamentally alien even though it was the same planet. When those ancient forests died, they accumulated in layers under the swamp water, where the absence of oxygen slowed decomposition and allowed the organic material to build up and eventually to be buried under sediment, compressed, heated by the pressure of overlying rock over millions of years. Transformed through a process called coalification into peat, and then lignite, and then bituminous coal, and finally, in the specific geological conditions of the Pennsylvania anthracite region, where ancient tectonic forces folded and compressed the rock into steep ridges, into anthracite, into the hardest, most carbon-rich, most energy-dense form of coal that nature produces. And then, between roughly 1840 and 1950, human beings found it and pulled it out of the ground, in quantities that are almost incomprehensible to think about. The anthracite region of Pennsylvania, a roughly 500 square mile area in Schuylkill, Carbon, Luzerne, Lackawanna, and Northumberland counties, produced somewhere between 4 and 5 billion tons of anthracite coal over the century of peak mining. 4 to 5 billion tons. Extracted by hundreds of thousands of miners working in conditions of extraordinary physical hardship, going underground every day into shafts and drifts and chambers carved through the coal seams, breathing coal dust, working in the dark, supporting a regional economy that at its peak employed more than 180,000 miners in Pennsylvania alone. Centralia was part of this world. It was incorporated as a borough in 1866, though the settlement had been growing since the 1840s when the coal companies began opening mines in the area. By the early 20th century, it had several thousand residents, a main street with businesses, multiple churches, a school, the texture of a functioning small American town, built entirely around the industry that ran under its feet. The Alexander Rasa Mine, the Centralia Mine, Locust Run, There were multiple operations employing men from the town and the surrounding area, tunneling through the layers of rock to reach the coal seams that ran through the hills, at angles that followed the ancient geological folding. The seams in the Centralia area are not horizontal. That is one of the things that matters enormously for the fire story. Because of the tectonic folding that created the anthracite region, the coal seams run at steep angles through the rock, sometimes nearly vertical, tilted and bent and folded in ways that make the three-dimensional map of the underground structure look like a crumpled piece of paper rather than a layer cake. The seams are connected to each other not just laterally but vertically, through these tilted angles, and the old mine workings, the chambers and tunnels left behind when the coal was extracted, follow these angles too, creating an underground network that is essentially a three-dimensional labyrinth of open spaces, some supported by pillars of coal or rock, some partially or fully collapsed, running through the hills in every direction at depths ranging from near the surface to several hundred feet down. When the active mining stopped in the mid-20th century, which it did throughout the anthracite region as markets shifted toward oil and natural gas and the most accessible coal was already extracted, this labyrinth was simply left. The mines were sealed at the surface, in some cases inadequately, and the underground infrastructure of a century of extraction was abandoned to the dark and the water that seeped in, and the slow processes of geological settling. The hills of Schuylkill County were, by 1960, Swiss cheese at a scale that defied easy comprehension. Full of air, full of connected passages, full of the specific conditions that, if a source of ignition were introduced, could allow a fire to find fuel and oxygen and spread through the rock in ways that would be nearly impossible to predict and extremely difficult to stop. The ignition source was introduced in 1962. On that point, there is substantial agreement. On the specific circumstances, there has always been some dispute, and the dispute matters because it became a source of bitterness and legal argument and community conflict for decades, which is a very human thing to add to a story about a geological catastrophe, the question of who is to blame. The most widely accepted account, supported by multiple investigations, is that a fire was set in an open trash dump at the edge of the town, in a pit that had been created in an old strip mine cut as part of a pre-Memorial Day cleanup. The borough had used this pit as a dump for some years. On May 27, 1962, the trash was set on fire, as was common practice at the time, burning garbage being a standard method of waste disposal in small American towns in that era. Before the modern system of landfills and recycling and environmental regulation made open burning illegal and culturally alien, the fire was put out. Or it appeared to be put out. But somewhere in the base of that dump pit, which sat over or adjacent to an abandoned mine working connected to the seams running through the hills, a coal vein caught. The exact mechanism by which the surface fire communicated itself to the underground coal is a matter of ongoing geological debate. Some accounts suggest the dump pit had been dug into the earth deeply enough that its base was in contact with old mine workings near the surface. Others suggest that a previously existing fire in the mine, possibly one that had been smoldering from an even earlier dump fire in the 1930s and never fully extinguished, was reignited. The specific answer matters less than the consequence, which is that, by the summer of 1962, there was a fire burning underground in Centralia that no one had a ready plan for, that grew hotter and more extensive through the summer and fall, and that would prove to be the beginning of something that no one in the borough, and no one in the state or federal government, would successfully stop. The first attempts to extinguish the fire were almost heartbreakingly inadequate, given the scale of what they were facing. Water was pumped into the mine openings, trenches were dug to try to cut off the fire's access to fresh coal. The Pennsylvania Department of Mines sent crews. The Centralia borough contracted with mining companies. Various techniques that had worked to suppress underground mine fires in other circumstances were attempted one by one and failed one by one, because the conditions in Centralia's underground were particularly hostile to fire suppression. The steeply angled seams allowed the fire to travel up as heat rose, spreading into new areas of coal above the original ignition point. The extensive network of old mine workings provided pathways for air to reach the fire. The depth and complexity of the underground structure made it impossible to simply dig down to the fire and smother it. What happened in the years between 1962 and the early 1980s is a story of escalating failure, of proposals made and funded and tried and abandoned, of state and federal agencies arguing about jurisdiction and responsibility, of the residents of Centralia, watching their town begin to die around them, while the fire beneath it grew. There were moments when it seemed like progress might be made. A proposal in the late 1960s to excavate a trench around the fire and cut it off from fresh fuel came close to implementation, but was abandoned after cost projections mounted. Further attempts at flushing the mine workings with water and incombustible slurry achieved temporary local cooling, but not extinguishment. The fire moved. It was always moving, following the seams, following the oxygen, going where the coal was, and where the old mine workings provided the ventilation it needed to keep burning. The residents of Centralia, meanwhile, were living with the fire in increasingly direct and personal ways. The most famous incident, the one that brought national attention to the town in 1981, involved a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski, who was walking in his grandmother's backyard on a February afternoon, when the ground gave way beneath him and he dropped into a sinkhole. The hole was 4 feet wide at the surface and deepened to nearly 150 feet. It was venting steam and carbon monoxide, which is what a mine fire exhaust into enclosed spaces does, pushing out gases that are invisible and odorless and lethal in concentration. Todd's cousin, 14-year-old Eric Wolfgang, was close enough to grab his hands as he fell and held on until Todd could be pulled out. If Eric had not been there, if Todd had been walking alone, he would have disappeared into the gas-filled void in his grandmother's backyard on a Tuesday afternoon in February, in a town that was quietly being destroyed from underneath. That incident and the increasing visibility of the fire's effects at the surface, including roads that were warm to the touch and steaming in cold weather, ground temperatures elevated enough to affect vegetation, the occasional subsidence that created depressions and sinkholes, and the carbon monoxide readings that were beginning to appear in the basements and ground floors of homes near the most active areas, finally forced a federal response. In 1984, Congress appropriated $42 million for the voluntary relocation of Centralia's residents. Most took the buyout. Over the following years, most of the homes and businesses in Centralia were demolished after their residents left, and the lots were cleared and graded, leaving the grid of streets in place but the structures gone, so that Centralia increasingly resembled a town-shaped absence. The layout of a community without the community itself. Street signs pointing down roads where no buildings remained. By 1990, the population of Centralia had dropped from over 1,000 people in 1981 to just a few dozen. A legal battle over the remaining holdouts, residents who refused to leave, who rejected the buyout, and challenged the state's condemnation of their properties in court, stretched on for years. In 1992, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania condemned all properties in the borough. A decade-long legal fight followed. In 2013, a settlement was reached that allowed the remaining handful of residents, by then fewer than 10 people, to remain in their homes for the duration of their lives, with the properties reverting to the state when they died or chose to leave. Those few remaining residents, aging now, living in a borough that has been otherwise emptied, are the last witnesses to what Centralia was. The fire itself, during all of this human drama, was doing what fire does when it encounters the specific conditions of a deep Pennsylvania anthracite mine. It was spreading, it was deepening, it was transforming. Let us talk about what the fire has actually done to the underground, what is actually happening down there right now, because this is the part of the Centralia story that gets the least attention and is in many ways the most extraordinary. Underground coal mine fires are not rare events globally. There are hundreds of them burning around the world at any given time. China has the largest concentration, with fires burning in the Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia coal fields that are estimated to consume somewhere between 10 and 200 million tons of coal per year, threatening entire regional landscapes and producing greenhouse gas emissions that are significant at a national scale. Australia has a coal seam fire at Burning Mountain in New South Wales that is estimated to have been burning for 6,000 years, which makes it the oldest known coal fire in the world, and which burns so slowly and at such depth that it moves only about 1 meter per year. The coal fields of Jharia, in Jharkhand, India, have been burning since 1916 and have displaced communities and transformed the landscape around them in ways that are still ongoing. There are fires in Indonesia and Turkey and the United States in mines that are less famous than Centralia, but burning for longer or covering more territory. But the Centralia fire has specific characteristics that make it a particularly compelling subject for understanding what underground coal combustion actually does to the geological structure it inhabits. The anthracite coal in the Centralia area burns differently from softer coals. Anthracite combustion is more complete, meaning it converts more of the carbon to carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide and produces less of the unburned hydrocarbons and particulates that characterize the combustion of lower-rank coals. It burns at higher temperatures when it burns well, which in an underground mine environment with good oxygen supply can mean temperatures of 800 to over 1,000 degrees Celsius at the active combustion front. At those temperatures, the rock surrounding the burning coal does not just sit there, it changes. Shale, which is the most common rock type interbedded with coal seams in the Pennsylvania anthracite region, behaves in specific ways under high heat. At temperatures around 600 degrees Celsius, clay minerals in shale undergo dehydration, losing chemically bound water, shrinking, becoming structurally weakened. Between 600 and 900 degrees, further mineral transformations occur, with clay minerals converting to new mineral phases, the rock changing its fundamental character at the atomic level. Above 900 degrees, some of the minerals in the shale begin to sinter, to partially fuse together, creating a material that is harder in some respects but fractured and distorted in ways that make it structurally unreliable. The sandstone layers that also occur in the sequence behave differently, but also change, with quartz grains expanding and contracting at different rates from the surrounding minerals, creating internal stresses that crack the rock on cooling. The coal seams themselves, as they burn, do not simply disappear cleanly. The combustion process in an underground setting is complex and spatially variable. At the active combustion front, where the coal is burning in the presence of adequate oxygen at its highest temperature, coal is being consumed relatively efficiently, converting to gas and ash. But around that front, in areas where oxygen supply is limited or temperature is lower, different things happen. Coal can undergo partial pyrolysis, a process where heat in the absence of sufficient oxygen drives off volatile components, converting the coal to a coke-like material that is different in character from the original coal. In some areas, coal tars and other organic compounds driven off by heat condense in cooler zones, depositing in pore spaces and cracks in the surrounding rock. In other areas, gases produced by the combustion and by the heating of surrounding organic matter migrate through cracks in old mine workings, sometimes traveling surprisingly far from the active fire before reaching the surface. The spatial pattern of the Centralia fire underground is not a simple sphere or front moving outward in all directions at equal rates. It is a complex three-dimensional pattern shaped by the geometry of the coal seams themselves, by the availability of oxygen through old mine workings and surface cracks, by the moisture content of the rock in different areas, by the specific heat conductivity and combustibility of different sections of the seams. The fire moves fastest where conditions are best for combustion, and slowest or not at all where conditions are poor. It moves along seams and follows their tilt, so it has moved both laterally through the hills and vertically along the inclined seam structure. It is probably split into multiple connected zones with varying temperatures and activity levels, some burning hot and active, others smoldering at lower temperatures, others perhaps temporarily extinct but connected to active zones in ways that could allow reignition. The extent of the current fire, meaning the area of active combustion and elevated temperature underground, is genuinely uncertain. This is one of the remarkable things about the Centralia situation. 6 decades into a fire burning under a former town in the United States, we do not have a precise, current, fully validated map of exactly where the fire is and where it is not. The underground is not easily observable. Drilling programs to measure temperatures at different depths and locations have been conducted periodically, and thermal imaging surveys have been done from the surface, and various mapping efforts have been made, but the data is always partial and always somewhat out of date, because by the time you have analyzed your measurements and drawn your map, the fire has moved. The most widely cited estimates, based on surveys conducted over the years by state agencies and academic researchers, suggest that the fire now covers an area of somewhere between 150 and 400 acres underground, with some estimates going higher. This area extends under the former footprint of the borough and into the hills to the north and east, following the coal seams into terrain that was never developed with housing. The fire appears to have moved significantly to the north and northeast of its original location in the years since it started, which reflects both the slope of the coal seams in that direction and the connectivity of old mine workings that provided pathways for both air supply and fire spread. The depth of the fire varies across this area, in some places near the original ignition point and in areas where strip mining brought the coal seams close to the surface. The fire has been burning at depths of only 20 to 30 feet. These are the areas where surface effects are most visible, where the ground warms measurably, where vegetation is stressed or absent, where cracks in the asphalt of old roads steam in cold weather. In other areas, the seams descend to depths of several hundred feet, and the fire burning at those depths is essentially invisible at the surface, except through careful measurement. What does the space left behind by the burning coal look like? This is a question that is partly answerable and partly speculative, because no one has physically accessed the areas of active or recent combustion in the Centralia underground. But the physics and geology tell a fairly clear story. As coal burns and is consumed, the void that contained it collapses. Unlike a structural demolition, where you remove a support element and the structure above fails catastrophically and quickly, the collapse of an underground coal seam void is typically a slow process, mediated by the strength of the overlying rock and the geometry of the void. In areas where the burnt-out seam is thin, the overlying rock may span the void like a bridge for years before eventually failing. In areas where the seam was thick and the burnt void is large, collapse happens more readily. The rock above the burnt void, already heated and weakened by the fire passing through and under it, settles and fractures and eventually falls into the void, creating a rubble zone of broken rock that partially fills the space where coal once was. This settling and collapse process is what creates the sinkholes and surface subsidence that have appeared in Centralia over the years. It is not instantaneous. The process of combustion at depth, followed by slow thermal weakening of the surrounding rock, followed by eventual collapse and settling of the overlying material, can take years or decades to work its way up to the surface. This means that the surface effects visible today are not a real-time display of where the fire is right now. They are, in a sense, a delayed and partial record of where the fire was years ago. The surface subsidence and the visible thermal anomalies are like an afterimage, the landscape registering what happened underground years before in a slow geological time signature. The carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide that the fire produces does not disappear underground. It migrates. Gases move through porous rock and through fractures and through old mine workings, driven by pressure gradients and temperature differences, finding paths to the surface where they vent from cracks and old mine shafts and the fracture zones created by subsidence. The routing of these gases underground is complex and partly unpredictable, which is why dangerous gas concentrations have been measured in locations that appeared, based on surface observations, to be well away from the active fire zone. The gas does not follow a straight line from its source to the surface. It follows the network of open spaces underground, and that network, shaped by a century of mining, is extensive and irregular. What this means in practical terms is that the former residential areas of Centralia are not merely sitting over a fire. They are sitting over a slowly transforming underground structure that is generating heat and gas and causing ongoing collapse and settling, all in a slow and spatially variable way that makes the precise current state of the underground genuinely difficult to characterize without continuous monitoring. The sulfur in anthracite coal adds another layer of chemical complexity to what the fire is doing. When coal-containing sulfur compounds burns, it produces sulfur dioxide, which in the presence of water vapor can form sulfuric acid. It also produces hydrogen sulfide in oxygen-limited zones. These sulfur compounds interact with the rock and the mine water in the surrounding environment, potentially creating new mineral deposits, accelerating the weathering of certain rock types, adding to the chemical complexity of what the underground of Centralia looks like 60 years into continuous combustion. There is a stretch of Pennsylvania Route 61, which used to pass through Centralia, that was closed to vehicle traffic in 1993 after repeated cycles of cracking, buckling, and heaving made it unsafe. This section of road has since become one of the most visited locations in Centralia, not because it leads anywhere or provides access to anything in particular, but because it is a visible record of what the fire has done to the surface. The old highway surface, buckled and cracked and pushed upward in places by frost and subsidence, and the slow settling of the ground beneath it, has been used by visitors and spray paint artists and urban explorers as a kind of open-air canvas, covered in graffiti, that accumulates in layers like geological strata. And through the cracks in the old asphalt, in cold weather especially, steam and smoke rise. Not dramatically, not in gushers, but steadily, patiently, just rising from the ground as though the road is breathing, as though the earth under the road is alive in some minimal but persistent way. That steam is mostly water vapor. The hot rock underground heats groundwater that seeps into the mine workings, turning it to steam that rises through cracks and fractures to the surface. The carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide that vent through the same pathways are invisible, which is why the steam is visible and the dangerous components are not, which is why you cannot evaluate the safety of a location in Centralia simply by looking at where the steam is coming out. The visible and the dangerous are not the same thing. The ecology of the former town reflects the underground conditions in complex ways that are themselves a subject of ongoing scientific interest. The areas over the most active and shallowest portions of the fire have elevated soil temperatures that affect which plants can grow. Some plant species that would normally thrive in the Pennsylvania mountain climate are absent or stressed in these areas. Others, plant species that are more tolerant of warm soils or that can exploit the microclimate created by elevated soil temperatures, may actually do better in these locations than they would elsewhere. The overall pattern of vegetation on the former footprint of the borough is uneven and irregular in ways that partly reflect the underground thermal conditions, though separating the fire's effects from the effects of the demolition of the houses and the disruption of the soil that demolition created is not straightforward. The cracks and fractures in the ground that provide pathways for gas and steam also provide microhabitats. Small-scale temperature gradients in and around these features create microclimatic conditions that can support certain invertebrates and microorganisms. The underground fire is, in a strange way, a source of geothermal energy that is influencing the ecological community above it in ways that would be interesting to study comprehensively, though the logistical challenges of doing detailed ecological work in a location where the ground can give way and gas concentrations can be dangerous are obvious. There are bacteria. This is worth pausing on. The deep subsurface of the Earth, even in environments that seem entirely hostile to life, typically contains microbial communities. Deep mine environments, both active and abandoned, have been shown to host diverse assemblages of bacteria and archaea, many of them chemolithotrophs, organisms that derive energy not from sunlight or organic matter, but from chemical reactions involving minerals and gases. Sulfur-oxidizing bacteria, iron-oxidizing bacteria, methane-producing archaea. These and other groups are found in mine environments globally and would presumably be present in the Centralia underground as well, though the specific conditions created by the fire, the elevated temperatures, the specific gas mixtures, the mineral changes in the rock, would select for a community of microorganisms adapted to those conditions. The thermophilic, heat-loving bacteria and archaea that thrive in hot spring environments around the world have analogs in mine fire environments, and it would not be surprising if the hot zones of the Centralia underground host microbial communities that are notably different from anything in the surrounding unaffected rock. This is not merely an academic curiosity. Understanding the microbiology of mine fire environments has practical implications for understanding how fires spread, because microorganisms can affect the chemistry of the rock and the gases in ways that influence combustion conditions. And it connects the Centralia underground to a larger scientific story about life in extreme environments that has been transforming our understanding of the limits of biology over the past several decades. The water. Let us talk about the water, because water is central to everything that is happening underground in Centralia, and it is an aspect of the story that is rarely discussed. Mine voids fill with water when the pumps stop running. This is one of the most consistent features of abandoned mine landscapes globally. Active mines pump water continuously, because groundwater seeps into mine workings under pressure, and would flood them if not removed. When mining stops and pumping stops, the groundwater seeps in, and the mine workings slowly flood. In the anthracite region of Pennsylvania, where there are extensive connected mine workings under thousands of square miles of landscape, this flooding has created what are sometimes called subsurface lakes, vast bodies of mine water held underground at depths ranging from near the surface to hundreds of feet, in old shafts and drifts and chambers that are now flooded rather than air-filled. In the Centralia underground, the picture is complicated by the fire. Heat drives water out. The fire has created a zone around and above it where temperatures are high enough to vaporize groundwater, keeping that zone relatively dry. This dry-hot zone is bounded by a wetter-cooler zone where groundwater is present, and the boundary between these zones moves as the fire moves. The steam that vents at the surface is evidence of this boundary, of the zone where hot, dry rock meets cooler, wetter rock and groundwater is being converted to steam. Mine water in the anthracite region is typically acidic because pyrite, the iron sulfide mineral that is common in coal-bearing rock, oxidizes when exposed to air and water to produce sulfuric acid and dissolved iron, a process called acid mine drainage that is one of the most widespread and persistent environmental problems in the former coal mining regions of Pennsylvania and other Appalachian states. The chemistry of mine water in the Centralia area is influenced both by this normal acid mine drainage process and by the additional chemical inputs from the fire, the sulfur compounds it produces, the changes it makes to the mineral composition of the rock, the elevated temperatures in the mine water near the fire boundary. Characterizing the mine water chemistry in the vicinity of the Centralia fire in detail would be a significant scientific undertaking, and to the extent it has been done, the results are not widely publicized. The interaction between mine water and the fire is also a factor in the fire's behavior. Where cool groundwater can reach the active combustion zone, it absorbs heat and can locally suppress combustion. This is one of the mechanisms that has sometimes been proposed for extinguishing mine fires, flooding the mine workings with water to cool the coal below combustion temperature. For Centralia, this approach was considered and was used in a limited way in early suppression efforts, but the steeply dipping seams and the extensive connected mine workings made comprehensive flooding impractical, because water introduced in one location would find paths to drain away before it could cool the entire fire zone. Now let us talk about whether the fire can ever be put out, because this question has never gone away, even as it has been effectively answered in practical terms by the decisions made to relocate residents and abandon the town. The scientific and engineering question of extinguishment is separate from the political and economic question of whether to try, and the scientific answer is more nuanced than the popular narrative of an unstoppable fire suggests. The fire is not unstoppable in principle. It is burning coal, and that coal will eventually be consumed, or the fire will reach a point where conditions no longer support combustion. The questions are, how much coal is left to burn, how much time that will take, and whether there are practical intervention strategies that could accelerate the end of the fire or constrain its spread. On the question of remaining fuel, estimates have varied widely depending on assumptions about the extent of the coal seams, how much coal was already extracted by mining, and how much has been consumed by the fire so far. Some calculations suggest there could be enough coal remaining in the seams, accessible to the fire to sustain combustion for another century or more. Others suggest the figure could be much longer. There is enough uncertainty in the inputs to these calculations that the range of outcomes is genuinely large. The most detailed analysis of the Centralia fire's future trajectory was conducted by researchers from Penn State University and other institutions in various studies over the years. The general conclusion from this body of work is that without intervention, the fire will continue to expand into the coal-bearing hills to the north and east, following the seam structure, potentially spreading over an area much larger than its current footprint over the coming decades and centuries. The rate of spread is slow enough, perhaps a few feet to a few dozen feet per year depending on conditions, that it does not create immediate emergency at the surface, in the former town footprint, where the coal nearest the surface has largely already burned. But the expansion into deeper, less mined territory in the hills could sustain the fire for a very long time. The practical options for intervention that have been discussed by engineers and geologists over the years include complete excavation of the fire zone, which even in the 1980s was estimated to cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and would have required removing and replacing enormous volumes of earth, essentially strip mining the entire area over the fire in a controlled way. This was the option that was seriously considered in the 1980s before the decision was made to relocate residents instead. At current costs, a similar effort today would be even more expensive and would face additional regulatory and permitting challenges. Alternatively, grouting programs injecting cement-like slurries into the rock to seal off oxygen supply to the fire have been proposed and partially implemented. These approaches work best for fires in relatively shallow and accessible seams and have had some success in other mine fire situations. For Centralia, the deep and complex seam structure and the extensive old mine working network make comprehensive oxygen cutoff through grouting extremely difficult. A third approach, passive management, which is essentially what has been happening for the past several decades, accepts that the fire will continue and focuses on monitoring its extent, managing surface effects such as subsidence and gas venting, and keeping the public safe from the most hazardous areas. This is not a satisfying answer to the question of extinguishment, but it is the answer that has been operationally adopted, and the reality is that for a fire of this complexity, in a location where the human population has already been relocated, the cost-benefit analysis of active extinguishment has never favored the enormous expense that would be required. The state of Pennsylvania retains official responsibility for Centralia. The borough still technically exists as a legal entity, though with essentially no permanent population and no functioning municipal government. There are periodic reviews of the situation, monitoring programs, and ongoing assessment of whether conditions in the remaining occupied properties pose unacceptable risks. The zip code of Centralia was officially revoked by the United States Postal Service in 2002. The borough's charter was technically revoked by the Commonwealth in 1992, though subsequent legal proceedings restored some aspects of its official existence. Centralia exists in a bureaucratic space that is as unusual as its physical one, a place that is officially recognized but practically absent, a geography and a legal entity without a community. The few people still living there, fewer than 5 by recent accounts, are not hermits or eccentrics in the sensational sense that media coverage sometimes implies. They are people who had deep roots in this place, who watched their neighbors leave over the years, who fought for their right to stay in the homes where they raised their families, who made a choice that many people can understand, even if they would not make the same choice themselves. They are the end of something that was once a town, the last remaining living connection between the place that Centralia was and the strange, smoldering, largely empty landscape that it has become. The physical landscape of Centralia today is something that photographs and descriptions do not fully capture, because the strangeness is partly about scale and partly about the gap between what you expect and what you find. You drive into what the map tells you is a borough. There is a sign. There are streets, real streets with names and curbs and street signs in relatively good condition because Pennsylvania maintains them. There are stop signs at intersections where there is almost nothing to stop for. There are fire hydrants on corners where there are no buildings. There are front yard spaces, roughly lawn-sized, flat and grassed over, where once there were porches and doors and windows. There are driveways that end at nothing. The grid of a town is completely intact and the town has been removed from it. And then there are the cemeteries. The cemeteries were not demolished. The graves of the people who built Centralia, who worked its mines and worshipped in its churches and grew up in its houses, remain. There are 3 active cemeteries in Centralia: the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary Cemetery, the Orthodox Cemetery, and the Odd Fellows Cemetery. They are maintained. They are tended. People still come to visit graves there. The dead of Centralia did not relocate when the living left. They are still there on the hillside, their monuments standing in the middle of a landscape that is otherwise cleared and empty, and the ground under those cemeteries is part of the landscape being slowly transformed by the fire burning beneath it. There is something profound about that image that I want to sit with for a moment. The only permanent residents of Centralia are the dead, and even their home is not permanent, because the fire under the hillside does not distinguish between the ground under a cemetery and the ground under a house or a road or a schoolyard. It burns what it finds. It follows its seams. It does what fire does, which is to continue as long as there is fuel and oxygen, and it has been given both by an accident of geology and human action, and 62 years of failure to stop it. The mythology of Centralia has grown up around the visible, the steam from the road, the emptiness of the streets, the sense of a place abandoned to an unstoppable force. And from that mythology has come a cultural resonance that has extended well beyond Pennsylvania. The video game franchise Silent Hill, with its imagery of an industrial town wreathed in toxic fog and decaying infrastructure, and ground that opens into hellish underground spaces, was directly inspired in part by Centralia and by a similar mining disaster community in Ontario called Mindu Mine. The Centralia imagery was a specific reference in the development of the Silent Hill aesthetic, the idea of a real place where normal geography and normal habitation had been replaced by something threatening and unreliable, where the ground itself could not be trusted, where the visible surface was disconnected from a dangerous hidden reality. This is a powerful cultural resonance precisely because it maps onto something real about the Centralia situation, not in a supernatural sense, but in a genuine one. The ground in Centralia cannot be trusted. It can give way. It is warmer than it should be. It vents gases that are invisible and dangerous. The infrastructure of a town is present. The streets, the signs, the hydrants, but the safety and stability that infrastructure implies has been undermined in the most literal possible sense. The horror that people feel when they encounter the imagery of Centralia is not irrational. It is a recognition of a real thing, that the familiar can become dangerous, that the ground under your feet is not a given, that the